And as I told you, modern man isn't the smartest human that has ever been around. The smartest human is probably Neanderthal man. As you can see, his brain is bigger than modern man's brain is. It was configured a little bit differently. Does that mean anything? We're not exactly sure. By looking at DNA, what we've determined is that there are select individuals who have Neanderthal DNA, and they are offspring. Well, they are select individuals, ancestors. Europeans, for example, Asians, anybody that's not African. Africans don't seem to have any Neanderthal DNA, but everybody else seems to have. So you and I, both of us, despite the fact we're of different ethnicities, we have Neanderthal DNA. Now part of the problem is select individuals don't like to have their DNA checked. Indigenous peoples find it insulting. There's a reason for that. Once upon a time, Europeans tried to prove that they were superior to everybody else by using science. There was what was the guy's name? I can't think of Wernicke. It wasn't Wernicke. Broca. Broca was a Frenchman. He was trying to prove that the French people were the most evolved people in the world. So he started measuring things. He started measuring brain size. He started looking at people's skulls. He collected skulls from all around the world. He was trying to show that the French were the most evolved people on the earth. That was his plan. Well, when you start out saying I'm superior to you, what's the probability you're going to find out that you're not superior, that they're not superior? Because you're going to be looking for evidence that proves that you were correct. That's what Broca did. Yeah. That's what Broca did. Anyway, so he measured people's brains, and what he discovered was that there are select Africans with small brains, and select people with very much larger brains. And what he discovered was that actually, if he had looked at it correctly, this is what he had discovered. If you live in a hot climate, you've got a smaller head. And you're taller and more slender. So if you look at all the people in the Kalahari and the Sahara Desert, they're all tall and slender. If you look at the Eskimo, if you look at the people living way up north, they're short and squat. So their arms are short, their heads are big, and that's to conserve heat. So it looked like the Eskimo were the most evolved people. What are the Inuit and Aleut now? What we recognize as Inuit and Aleut. Then he decided he would check arms because he was looking at orangutans, and he said, look at the difference between their forearm and their upper arm. There's the forearm is much longer than the upper arm. So the most evolved people must be the individuals whose forearm and upper arm were about the same length. That was his assumption. That was his premise anyway. So he started measuring people's heads and arms and whatnot. He started measuring their arms all around the world. And actually, somebody does this here. Margaret Meyer or somebody does one of these experiments where they go around and measure your arms. And one of the things that he discovered was that once again, you know, those guys in the Kalahari Desert, the people that have to live in the Sahara, their arms are really long, so their forearms tend to be relatively long. The people that seem to be the most evolved were once again the Eskimo, the Inuit and Aleut. So I know.
So it's based primarily on the environment?
That has to do with the mass, your
Yeah,
mass.
okay.
Yeah, okay.
But it has nothing really to do with
Intelligence?
Yeah.
Intelligence has to do with how many convolutions you have in your brain. Doesn't have anything to do with brain mass. You can have a real dummy with a great big head, or you can have a real smart guy with a real small head. They decided that what they would do was measure head volume. And what they discovered was, let me see, what is this? And what they discovered was, so they had all these men of science all of these intellectuals, they wanted their brains weighed after they died. So they would take them after they died and they'd weigh their brains. Well, one of the largest brains was a guy by the name of Turgenev, a guy from Russia, a Russian. So does that mean the Russians are more intelligent than anybody else? No, he had this huge brain, it's like 1,900 grams. It was huge. The guy with the smallest brain was an author. He was an author. And the guy with the smallest brain was a guy from France who was named Anatole France. His was less than 1,000 grams. I know.
Wow.
So one had almost 2,000, the other one had less than 1,000.
Yeah.
Yet they were both authors, and they were both brilliant authors. So what does that mean? What that means is volume doesn't have anything to do with it.
Yeah.
I have a relatively, okay IQ. I had the smallest head in the Air Force. If my head was any smaller, they would have probably not let me go into the service. My head was so small. 6 7/8 was the smallest hat they had, and that was my size.
Okay, yeah, you were saying that.
Which, I don't know what that means. It's too painful to even think about. Wait a minute. There we go. All right. Anyway, as you can see, humans have a much larger brain volume. They measured the size, the shape, and whatnot.
And that's just like the average, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So mine is smaller than that. Obviously, my head's small. But I have a brother that's got a head the size of a basketball. And he's really smart. He's got a really high IQ. He's not all that smart. He's never held a job. He can't hold down a job because he keeps telling people why they're wrong. People don't like that.
Yeah.
You probably have noticed that people really don't like to be told how wrong they are. So, yeah. The only thing he's ever been able to function in is the military.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, because in the military he has to shut up. There we go. Yeah. He doesn't have a choice. He can be ordered to keep his mouth shut. The brain contains about 100 billion neurons and an equal number of glial cells. It's estimated that there are maybe as many as 100 trillion connections within the brain. So it's got about 200 billion cells in the brain with 100 trillion connections. That's how smart we are. That's why it's almost impossible for a computer to be as smart as a human, because to put together 100 trillion connections in a computer, that's nearly impossible. I mean, who's going to do it, for one thing? I know, exactly.
Yeah.
While genetics play an important role in creating the brilliant creatures that each and every one of us may be, the environment guides the process of development. And here, once again, we were talking about environment before, creating the size and shape of your brain. Depending on how much stimulation you get in your environment, there should be more connections, as logical as that is. Okay, I asked my students a question in another class about IQ, and they were saying there was this huge IQ jump in the 1950s, and of course I was in grade school in the 1950s. Why in the world? What happened in the 1950s that would create this huge IQ jump in the United States? What happened? Television.
Oh, yes.
Television. So before that, it was all radio.
Yeah.
And it was mostly comedies. But then television started, and when it started out, they didn't have anything to show except all these extraneous films that they had. So they showed a lot of films, and a lot of them were instructional films and educational films, because that's all they had. I mean, who's going to make a film about, unless you're watching a movie, a comedy, who's going to show that crap on television? So they had all these instructional films. So while I was growing up in the early 1950s, I was watching a lot of instructional television. talking about industry and talking about how steel is made and, you know, all of these things, trying to sell things, as weird as that is. So there was this huge IQ jump because all these kids were just fascinated with this stuff. The cartoons, they hadn't started making their cartoons en masse like I mean, you can watch cartoons all day long if you want. But in those days, you got maybe 30 minutes of cartoon a day, and the rest of it was pretty much educational, as weird as that is. So we watched a lot of educational television, and because of that, we had this huge IQ jump. Well, I was living I lived on a farm, and we were living way out, but we could get television, thank goodness. And I went to a rural school. Well, the rural school was put together to make factory workers and farmers. They were farm kids and factory workers' kids. So it was a blue-collar rural school. And here, all of a sudden, we had all these geniuses, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. Eventually, they did. I mean, it took them decades to figure out why in the world would they have this whole cluster of geniuses especially in a rural school. That really upset people, because the people that were doing the testing were all professors, and the professors wanted their kids to be the smart ones, not, you know, these farm kids and these factory workers kids.
Yeah.
They couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. So they talked about the teachers cheating and giving answers and teaching the test, which is what they do now, of course. But and that's not what was happening at all. It didn't have anything to do with that. It had to do with the fact that we were the first generation of kids watching television. I have a sister that's a year older than I am, and her class didn't have the same thing. See, that didn't make any sense to anybody. Why were the people that started school in 1955 smarter than the kids that started school in 1954? What happened there? And the answer is television started when I was 2 and 3 years old, when I first started understanding words. Her television started when she was 4 and 5 years old, so she wasn't that interested in television. Okay, but you know, me and all my cohorts, we started school, I mean, it just happened to hit at the right time. If it had hit it at a different time, then she probably would have had as high an IQ as the rest of us. It was really kind of bizarre. So my class had 18 geniuses in it. They'd never seen that before. Class of 72 kids, we had 18 geniuses. That's just way, that skews all the averages. And we didn't see that and they didn't see that in the urban areas. There was an urban area right beside where we lived, and they didn't see that over there. And that was a college town, so they had all those professors' kids, and they didn't see the same thing. But the difference was the television. That's what it was. It was television. Jiminy Christmas. The most rapid brain growth is during gestation, but it continues to expand markedly through language acquisition years. Language acquisition years, that's when we first started watching television, when we were acquiring language. So our language skills were superior to other kids because we watched a lot of television. And of course you don't have people speaking in an accent or a patois on television. Everybody speaks correctly on television. So we learned to speak correctly because our language acquisition years were the years that television came to the fore. For an egg to be fertilized and come to term, everything has to be perfect. And this is something that we need to understand. No matter what you do, if I screw up my sperm by smoking pot, which just knocks the hell out of your semen, just really depletes your sperm, abnormal forms, poor motility. I mean, it really messes up your you can't use it as a birth control. I mean, that doesn't work. But if you're doing something to yourself, or if you're what's a good example? Taking ecstasy, for example. Ecstasy raises your body temperature. And in which case, if you're a male, of course, then you're not producing sperm because your body, that's the reason your testicles are distended from your thorax, because if it was attached to your thorax, it would be too hot to produce sperm. So if you're taking ecstasy, and you take ecstasy over a series of weekends, then potentially one of the things you're doing is destroying your ability to produce sperm. As stupid as that sounds. Anyway, okay. So everything has to be perfect in order to reproduce. And that's one of the reasons why we get so few mutations, babies with mutations. We get so few babies that can't survive. It doesn't happen very often. I was watching a movie last night where the baby died, and I'm going, the baby was stillborn. That doesn't hardly happen anymore. It didn't really hardly happen back then. The problem usually was the fact that the mother wasn't large enough for the baby to come out. So the baby died before they were able to get it out. Yeah, let's see, before cesarean section and whatnot. Before cesarean section became normal. What did I read? Women are getting taller, and because women are getting taller, it's creating more babies that are born cesarean, because we're giving up pelvic girth for height, and because of that, they're just not large enough to have a baby.
Yeah.
Both of my children were cesarean sections. My daughter had a baby, and she had to have cesarean section.
Wow.
So yeah, I know. In Argentina, is it Argentina? No, it's Brazil. Was it Argentina? It's one of those South American countries. Over half the babies are born cesarean. They don't even try to have natural birth. They just schedule them for surgery because they're tall and slender. Doesn't work. Anyway, so for everything, if a woman is pregnant and she doesn't lose the baby in the first trimester, then she probably has a perfect baby. It doesn't happen very often that she doesn't, unless she does something stupid while she's pregnant. Because the 23 chromosomes go together and everything turns out perfectly. I can't tell you how many births I've been in on, thousands of them, and it's very rare for any oddities to happen. I used to work in a children's hospital, and we'd have maybe 2 or 3 a month, a week, come in with problems. And we were the children's hospital for Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota. So we were getting everybody from Des Moines all the way to Omaha, from all through Nebraska, in southern South Dakota. We had all the kids, and we very rarely had any kids with any problems. It was really kind of weird. So babies are born perfect, and they don't survive in the womb unless they are perfect. They usually don't make it past the first trimester. Okay, so a miscarriage probably means there was something wrong. Something wrong. It may have been the mother. Probably was the offspring, and it's not viable. If it's not viable, it can't. The mother will miscarry it. The sperm must have a full complement of 23 chromosomes. This almost always happens. When a male ejaculates, he ejaculates millions and millions. Remember, we're making 38,000 per second or something like that, depending on whether your testicles are distended. Anyway, we're making thousands every minute. Of course, unless the sperm is not motile, then it won't be able to make it all the way up to the ova, as weird as that is. If you have an abnormal form, one of my jobs when I was younger, working in the service, and as a lab tech, I got to do sperm counts, which are not the most fun things in the world, but you got to watch those little tadpoles swimming. And you had to estimate how many abnormal forms there were. Sometimes you get sperm without a head, sometimes you get a head without a tail. Sometimes you get them where they were crooked, the tail was crooked, so they swam around in circles. Those are all abnormal forms. And if they smoked pot, this was a pot smoker, you saw just tons of those guys in there. I mean,
Wow.
non-functional sperm. They couldn't go anywhere, they couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
A sperm without a tail is just a head, and it's not gonna do anything. It's just a tail. The tails are the funny part, because they got no head, and they're just, flipping all over the place. And you'll see, a dozen of these guys swimming around. It means that the guy was probably smoking pot.
So, is it like the head and the tail, are they like separate from each other?
No.
Like,
they're
what
supposed to be.
what I mean is like, the tail can function without the head and the
Yeah.
head can function without the tail, okay.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
they're being produced, and they're being produced in that form. Right behind the head is a power pack. I don't think I have a picture of this one. There's a power pack right behind it. So you got the head, which is triangular shaped, and then you've got this power pack right behind it, and then comes the tail. So sometimes you'll get a power pack and a tail without a head, and sometimes you'll get a head without a power pack or a tail. Yeah,
Okay.
it's really kind of bizarre. I don't have a picture of the sperm. Okay, not important. Well, kind of important. The ovum must have a full complement of 23 chromosomes to be in the right position when the sperm reaches it. Everything has to be perfect for this to happen. A miscarriage is a waste of energy, and this doesn't happen very often. Very, very rarely do miscarriages occur. If implantation is to take place, the uterine wall must be ready for implantation. The zygote must implant near the top of the uterus. If it implants on the bottom, it will probably not survive. All that you would need to do would be for the woman to pick something up and strain, and that pressure, that abdominal pressure, would dislodge the zygote, unfortunately. Adequate vascularization must take place between the embryo and the uterus. Growth and cell division must take place on a continual and balanced pattern. A lot of women cannot give birth, and the reason they can't give birth may be any of these situations. The ova has to be impregnated, fertilized. It has to be fertilized while it's still in the fallopian tube.
Oh, okay.
Okay, if it's wandering around in the uterus, then it probably won't be fertilized, even though the sperm are swimming around trying to fertilize it.
Well, back to the person that smokes weed, is it the same with women as well?
No, it's not. No, it just has to do with the sperm.
Oh, okay. So if a woman smokes weed, it does nothing to their...
Not that we've found out thus far.
Okay.
It's easy to check a male's semen.
Yeah.
You can just check their semen. He ejaculates into a cup, you take a look at it, and to see how many abnormal forms he has.
Okay.
And we know that, sometimes it's up to 70% abnormal forms, which is a lot. But that doesn't mean they can't impregnate somebody. They still have 30%.
Yeah, that's...
So if they're ejaculating, what's a normal amount? About 150 million per mil of semen. So if they're ejaculating, 5 cc's, that's 5 times 150. That's 750 million sperm. Exactly. Even if 70% of them aren't bad, that still gives you, 40 or 50 million sperm that are okay.
Yeah.
And of course, the abnormal forms are never going to make it up to the ova.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that mutation we don't have to worry about. The fact that an abnormal form is making it up all the way up to the ova. When we do artificial insemination, we make sure that the sperm is perfect before we allow it to even get anywhere close to the ova. I know this could be a potential problem in the future if we're doing a lot of artificial insemination and we're taking the male sperm. Usually what we will do is we'll spin it down because the male sperm male sperm are larger than female sperm. Okay, so we usually spin them down. If they want a girl baby, then we take it from the middle. If they want a boy baby, then we take it from the bottom, because that's where all the male sperm are. But of course, we never, theoretically, that's what we do, but there could be mistakes. People could make mistakes.
Yeah.
In which case, now all of a sudden, we got problems. We got a lot of mutated forms. But then again, the mutated forms would probably never survive. Mutations rarely survive. So all of this has to take place. So it could be a problem with the woman, it could be a problem with it's usually a problem with the woman, not the man. If he has a problem with his semen, he's got too many abnormal forms, his sperm count's low. These are all problems. One of the things that we've noticed is that since World War II, the normal sperm counts have gone way, way down. When I first started doing sperm counts, it was like the average was 300 million per mil. And now it's like, if you've got 100 million per mil, then that's okay. But in the old days weren't that long ago, they were only 50 or 60 years ago, we saw much, much higher sperm counts. And I'm not sure exactly what that means. We know that gorillas have relatively low sperm counts, but it's because they have exclusive access to all the females in their harem. So they don't need large sperm counts. Whereas chimpanzees, of course, if a female is in estrus, then all the males in the group will get to breed with her. So it's usually the first one, and they have very, very high sperm counts and huge testicles, which is really kind of weird. But it's not that weird. So human sperm counts are going down. This is really kind of interesting. Okay, so everything has to take place properly. There has to be adequate vascularization to take between the embryo and the uterus in order for the baby to feed. Growth and cell division must take place on a continual and balanced pattern. The growth has to be a continuous thing. This is the way that you add neurons to the brain. You add them in a continuous pattern. So if she's a good girl and she stays and she eats adequately and she never drinks any alcohol or uses any drugs, then the brain should develop normally. We should all be geniuses, but our mothers don't do that. As soon as the sperm penetrates the ova, the structure becomes a zygote. So it's an ova, and then the sperm fertilizes the egg and becomes a zygote. Zygote means yolk. It's Latin for yolk. Within 12 hours, a single cell divides into 2 cells. Within 2 weeks, the zygote becomes an embryo and divides into 3 distinct layers. So we've got 3 distinct layers that we're working with here. The nervous system develops from the outer layer of the 3 layers, the ectoderm. The ectoderm grows into a flat oval plate. The cells of the plate do not grow at the same rate, and a groove develops. This groove, let me get rid of that. That's irritating. Oh, it's gone. Well, it's not here. That doesn't make any sense. It's there, okay. All right. Sorry. I got a better picture of the groove in just a second. This groove is known as a primitive streak, and that's what it looks like when it develops. So it develops in a manner, it develops on the ends faster than it develops in the middle. As the cells continue to divide, the groove slowly grows into a neural tube, it pinches itself off and forms into a tube. The front or anterior portion of the tube divides into 3 structures that will become the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. So if we look at this, it looks like a worm, and the bottom part of it will become the spinal column, and the top part of it will become the brain. So the spinal column develops along the neural tube, and the top portion of it will become the brain. And it will start adding cells at a marked rate after this. The spinal column is pretty much already formed. By the 8th week of gestation, the fetus has developed all the rudimentary organs in its body. Its heart will start beating about this time. It doesn't have a heart. It just has cells that have a rhythm. The brain at this time takes up 1/2 of the fetus's mass. The brain will continue to grow through the teenage years. And of course, the brain doesn't stop growing until you're about 24, 25 years old. Then you have an adult brain. Before that, it's continually pruning neurons that it doesn't need. It's adding cells. And this is one of the reasons why we try to educate people starting at age 5 until they're adults. So that's the best time to add intelligence, because you're adding brain cells the entire time. But your ability to make decisions is not that good until you're in your 20s. Nervous system development takes place in 6 stages. The first is neurogenesis, the formation of neurons. The second is cell migration, movement of neurons to form nerve cell populations. This will become your intelligence in select areas, your ability to walk properly, your ability to smell things, to identify smells, whatnot. You have nerve populations. Differentiation, development of distinctive types of neurons. And of course, you have neurons that handle sight. You have neurons that handle sound. All of these have to do with differentiation. Synaptic genesis, development of synaptic connections. As axons and dendrites grow, this is something that's taking place almost instantaneously. So if we gave you ecstasy to take, and you took ecstasy for today, or today you took ecstasy, your ability to be happy tomorrow would not be very good. Probably in 2 days. Because what would happen, the serotonin, it increases your serotonin in your brain, ecstasy does, and then it becomes toxic, you become neurotoxic. So it causes your cells to reduce the number of receptor sites for serotonin so that you don't hurt yourself. It's trying to protect itself, so it would reduce the number of receptor sites for serotonin because you have too much serotonin splashing around in your brain. That's what the ecstasy is all about. And that has to do with synaptogenesis, all these connections. Eventually, if you take too much ecstasy, then some of these connections will be broken. Some of those neurons will die because of excitotoxicity. And now you've lost your ability to be as happy as you would have if you hadn't taken the damn ecstasy. Whoops. All right. And yeah, that's some of the things that alcohol does. A very similar thing. It's much less toxic as ecstasy, but people will take this stuff to be happy because they're not as happy as they want to be.
So like that, would that sometimes lead to like depression?
Sure.
Yeah?
Of course.
Okay. Wow. Well, I just thinking, it's just, I don't know how people can do that like all the time.
I know. And well, if you've ever been around a European, have you ever been to Europe?
No.
Okay. They're kind of dour. They're kind of, they don't smile a lot. They don't joke around. And that's one of the things they say about Americans. Americans are such happy people. They're always laughing. They're always making jokes. The Germans and the French and the English, they just don't do that kind of thing. Well, it may have something to do with some of the crap they've done to themselves over time. Oh, there it is again. Some of the stuff that they've done to themselves. We had a young lady, what in the world's going on? We had a young lady that from Switzerland who swore by ecstasy. She thought it was the greatest stuff in the world. Grouchiest lady you ever want to be around. She was just not a happy person. never smiled. Very attractive young lady, but of course she didn't have any boyfriends because she was grumpy. Who wants to be around somebody that's grumpy? Very attractive lady with no boyfriends is really kind of bizarre. Anyway,
That's interesting though, yeah.
maybe that has something to do with it. So what else are we doing? Synaptogenesis, we're making all these connections in our brain. Neuronal cell death, selective death of neurons. If a neuron isn't perfect, then it has to die. And of course, your brain has to tell it to die. And we're going to talk about apoptosis in just a second. Synapse rearrangement, refinement of synaptic connections. The first stage of nerve system development is neurogenesis. This is when the nerve cells are produced. Nerve cells themselves do not divide, but the pre-nerve cells, which are located in the inner layer of the neural tube, do divide, and they create a closely packed layer of cells called the ventricular zone. So we've got neurogenesis taking place, and this is how we mask all those neurons in our brain. The inner portion is white matter, and as we gain mass on the outside, it is gray matter. And the gray matter is where our intelligence comes from. The cells of the ventricular zone continue to divide and give rise to daughter cells, which also divide. All the body's neurons and glial cells are derived from ventricular mitosis. So it all comes from, whoops, I'm sorry, I went the wrong direction. It all comes from this layer, this ventricular layer. That's where all of our neurons come from. Neural cells will be completely developed by birth, so you have all the cells that you will ever need in your brain when you're born. You can add cells, you can prune cells, you can take them out, but we have all the mass that we possibly need when we're born. But we will add new cells, depending on our amount of stimulation. Each neural structure of the brain will develop at the same time in gestation for all humans. So if it's the baby's 5 months along, and we look at any baby, we can see that their neuronal generation is the same for all 5-month-old babies, unless mom did something stupid. Okay. Which moms do tend to do. Neurons of the developing nervous system are always on the move. During the cell migration stage, the cells of the ventricular layer begin to move where they will end up. In humans and other primates, by birth, all the neuronal cells will have found their way to where they will always be. So the cells in your occipital lobe will be in your occipital lobe, and they will have to do with eyesight. The neurons in your temporal lobe will be where they're supposed to be, and they will have to do with hearing and understanding language. Some neurons will creep down glial cells known as radial glial cells, and these are the ones that they migrate. This is part of the migration process, these glial cells. It's really kind of fascinating to watch them, jumping down neurons and jumping down other glial cells. Just kind of fascinating.
Wow.
Neurons can either move down the glial cells or jump from one to the next. This migration is guided by various chemicals called cell adhesion molecules. The cerebrum is formed by wave after wave of neurons till the entire cerebral cortex is formed. So it forms in all these layers. Now this becomes very important because the layers have to do with making connections from one thing to the other. We're talking about this, and you're filing this away. This has to do with memory. You're filing this away as far as psychology and neuronal structures. You're putting them in specific areas in your brain. This is how you remember things in layers. And so we have these structures. I told you before that what's the word? I'm columnar. So everything is arranged in columns from the first layer to the sixth layer. And so this is, you're a normal individual, so you recognize this, you understand all of these things because you can make all these connections. If you were schizophrenic, then those cells would be disorganized. So if you were thinking of neurons, all of a sudden you'd be thinking of goats, and then when you think of goats, of course, you think of sunshine. You know, it's making all these really odd connections. Now, as a normal human being, everything is columnar and everything is straight up and down. So when you think of neurons, you think of glial cells, you think of psychology, you think of thinking, and you know, all of this, one thing follows the other. But if you were schizophrenic, those cells would be disorganized because something has happened. Something genetic has happened to you, making the neuron structure different and making those columns indistinct. So when you start thinking of one thing, it goes off, you go off in a strange tangent because you're schizophrenic. Something has happened to your brain. Sometimes it's drugs, sometimes it's disease. If you have the flu during pregnancy, if your mother has the flu, during pregnancy, that can affect the structures in your brain. I know. So there's a lot of things. There needs to be some kind of a cerebral insult, a disease, taking the wrong drug at the wrong time. You know, that can cause schizophrenia. That can cause all these cells to be disorganized. Okay. You'll see this later on. I've got an example of this, not in this chapter, but another chapter. Just fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
How severe will it be? Will you really have schizophrenia? Well, possibly not. Maybe you'll have the same genetic structure seems to cause ADHD. It seems to cause autism. And I used to ask the question, which is worse, schizophrenia or autism? So which would be worse? Schizophrenia or autism? It's all on the same spectrum. It's all in the same genetic structure. ADHD seems to be the least severe of the problems that you can have. But what about autism and schizophrenia? Which is worse? Well, in the old days, autism was worse because in the old days, the person with autism would never learn to speak, about 70%. Now, of course, we have intense interactions with this individual, and we teach them how to speak. So it's very rare for somebody that's autistic not to learn to speak. But in the old days, it was like 70%. My neighbor. Okay. Anyway, fun stuff. Once the pre-neuronal cells reach their destination, genes in the cells begin to make the proteins that are required by the neurons. At this point, the neurons begin differentiating into the distinctive neurons of the region that they are in, and that it is the proteins that do this. So if it's in the occipital lobe, it has to do with eyesight, yada, 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 you know, the whole thing. And it's proteins that tell that cell what to do, what to make of itself. Most neuronal cells differentiate through induction. They take on the task of all their neighboring cells. That way you don't have an eyesight neuron in your hearing portion. It just wouldn't fit, and it wouldn't have a function. So it takes on the same job as everything else. Some cells are undifferentiated cells and will differentiate into cells that they are close to. These are known as stem cells. Stem cells are really important. And we've been looking at doing research with stem cells for a while now. We thought that possibly we could use stem cells to repair people's spinal damage. For somebody with some kind of a traumatic spinal injury. We've been thinking maybe we could implant stem cells in people's brains if they have damage to the brain, to a select area of the brain. If they have a stroke, put stem cells in there, and of course they will have the same function as all the cells around them. So we can use this to repair the human body, the stem cells. Why don't we do that? Once upon a time, we had a president by the name of George W. Bush, and he decided that this was acting too much like God. So they passed stem cell research in the United States, and he vetoed it. So we can't do stem cell research by law. We can't do stem cell research in the United States. They're doing stem cell research in Canada. They're doing stem cell research in China. They're doing stem cell research in Europe. But we don't do any stem cell research in the United States because George W. Bush decided it was too much like acting like God. I know, as weird as that sounds. So one guy decided that he didn't like the idea of stem cell research. Despite the fact it passed in both houses of Congress, he decided that he didn't want it to happen. They didn't have enough votes to override his veto. So we don't have stem cell research in the United States, unfortunately.
But they can change that though, right?
I'm sorry?
They can change that though, right?
Yeah, but we've never, okay. The very conservative people don't like the idea of stem cell research. They agree with Bush that it's acting too much like God. So right now, the conservative people in Congress have too much power to allow it to be overridden, the veto to be overridden. So we can pass the law again. If we have a president that will sign it into law, then potentially it would happen. But of course, the conservatives have a lot of power in Congress. At least they did. We'll see what happens in the next election. They seem to be losing power. Trump seems to be diluting their power because he does so many stupid things, like what he did last week.
Yeah.
What happened last week. I know, that was fun. And I watched that all Thursday and Friday. I couldn't turn it off. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. My God. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
I keep saying that. I don't know. The impeachment is going forward, so
Yeah.
that's kind of important. So we'll see if that takes hold.
I hope so.
Well, I mean, what did Nixon do? Nixon went into the Democratic headquarters and planted a bug so that he could defeat them. Eventually he did. He got 60% of the vote. It was one of the biggest landslides in history. And then of course he lost his presidency because he had cheated. Well, this looks like the same thing. The other question that people will have to ask, if he did this with Ukraine, why, I mean, if he's trying to get Ukraine to help him get dirt on his political opponents, why didn't he do that before? I mean, did he do it before?
Yeah.
This gives credence to the collusion with the Russians in the last election. Anyway, well, we won't go into that.
Yeah.
We'll assume that, well, we'll just, it's already water under the bridge to some extent. And he's already served almost a full term, at least 3 years anyway. When neurons migrate to the final destination, they start the process of synaptogenesis. Axons and dendrites begin to web out and making contact with cells that they are going to be responding to. This is done through swollen ends of dendrites and axons called growth cones. The growth cones reach out using fine filaments, filopodia or plates. Lamellipodia just means plate-shaped, and this is filament-shaped. And, oops, I thought I had a picture of it. Oh, that's not it. Okay. That must be another lecture. Growth cones are drawn by chemical signals called chemoattractants. Growth cones can also be repelled by chemical signals called chemorepellents. As adults, we maintain synaptogenesis structures, dendritic growth cones, axonic chemoattractants, and chemorepellents. So this is continually going on in our brains. This is how we learn things as adults. The synaptogenesis is continuing to take place. We have the growth cones making connections between one thing and the next. Synapses can form rapidly on dendrites and dendritic spines. The number of spines increase rapidly after birth and are affected by experience. So whatever you experience, and this is one of the reasons why you can take that ecstasy, you're going to get a downregulation of the amount of receptor sites because your brain's trying to protect itself. Your brain is always trying to protect itself. If you do something stupid, you take crystal meth or whatever, and you're getting all excited, your brain is trying to protect itself. It's going to downregulate the number of receptor sites. Otherwise, that neuron would die because of all the stimulation. So your brain is constantly trying to protect itself. If you get depressed, and this is one of the reasons why you can't stay depressed for an extended length of time, it's going to increase the number of receptor sites for serotonin and norepinephrine. So all you need to do is smile, and all of a sudden you're feeling a lot better. Why are you feeling a lot better? Because it's increased the amount of serotonin, or you just take a walk. Exercise increases the serotonin in your brain. Because you've been depressed, you've got more receptor sites looking for serotonin, and of course, when you produce more serotonin from just the activity, then you feel better. So that's one of the reasons why humans don't have extreme emotions for very long periods of time. People that stay depressed for months on end, that's nearly impossible, and that's one of the reasons why we have to do really odd things to those people, like electroshock therapy, because they're not responding to, they're not correcting themselves naturally. So it's really kind of interesting that the human body is trying to balance itself. This Hojo that you get, that Navajos talk about.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is the human body is in this on a continual basis. As long as you don't do something stupid, as long as something really horrible doesn't happen, then you probably will be able to maintain yourself. And that's one of the reasons why when somebody dies, somebody very important to you dies, you don't go into mourning for a year. You can't do that. It's too painful. The human body won't allow you to do that unless you're overly emotional, I guess. Anyway, and there are select individuals that just cannot recover from select things. Very sensitive individuals. I was watching a television show last night, and they were talking about a little boy that was overly anxious, and as he got older, he started having psychotic episodes. But he had always reacted to things in an extreme manner. So eventually, of course, he started taking antipsychotics, which helped him because antipsychotics block dopamine receptor sites. You have too many dopamine receptor sites, and you're getting stimulation that's not really there because you have all these dopamine receptor sites looking for something. So they're hearing sounds and they're seeing sites that don't really exist. Synapses can form rapidly on dendrites and dendritic spines. The number of spines increase rapidly after birth, of course. It has to do with experience. Has to do with stimulation. So the more stimulation the baby gets, the better off the baby is. So if you have a baby that is getting no stimulation at all, the brain growth will be very, very slow. There have been instances where they have taken their children and they've locked them up in the attic. They didn't talk to them. All they did was feed them. In cases like that, the individual never developed normally, despite the fact that they were normal at birth. But because they got so little stimulation, they weren't able to develop normally. Neuronal cell death, or apoptosis, is crucial to the brain development, especially during the embryonic stages. Neuronal cell death ranges from 20 to 80%. As amazing as that sounds, varying from region to region of the brain and spinal cord. There are certain things that have to happen in the right sequences. When you're born, you have all of these natural instincts. You have an instinct to swim. You have an instinct to grab onto things with your feet and your hands. This is an instinct, and eventually you'll lose that instinct. you can't naturally swim. I can't swim at all. I've never been able to swim. But theoretically, when I was born, I had the ability to swim. For one thing, I was a chubby little baby, so I had all that fat. And since I'm not so fat anymore, I can't swim. My mother tried to drown me several times. We were in Hawaii. She was in her 70s, I guess, maybe in her 80s. And she said, well, everybody can swim. I've been telling her for years I couldn't swim. And she said, everybody can swim. All you need to do is float. Of course, my mother's, 4'8". She's got, she's full-bodied. She's got all that fat on her chest. So she floated. Of course she floated. She's a woman. Women have all that excess fat, so of course they can float. Anyway, so she took me out in the ocean, and she held me, and I started not floating, and she kept catching me, and she said, "You can do it. You're just too stiff. Here, loosen up." And she dropped me, and I went right to the bottom. I went right to the bottom, and I don't know if ever been in Hawaii?
No.
There's this god-awful rip tide. So there's a tide going out, but it's like down at your feet. So as I went down, I got into that rip tide, and I was struggling to stand up, and I stood up, and the water was right to here. Of course, my mother's only 4'8", so I'm about 15 feet away from her. And I'm out in the ocean. She tried to drown me. Here's the funny part. She did it again, and I let her do it. And the next time, the water was like here. Okay. So they thought that I had drowned. And of course, she thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened. I think she's been trying to kill me most of my life. Anyway, so when my mother was in her 70s, she tried to drown me again. An area needs only so many neurons and synapses. As the area grows, more neurons than are needed flood into the area to ensure that the most perfect neuronal structure and synapse are created. So we have all these neurons going into the area, and unless it's perfect, it will be weeded out. It will destroy itself. It will be told, we don't need you here, go ahead and destroy yourself. The cells that die are self-selecting to die. They are committing suicide. It's really kind of bizarre. So we have all these neuronal cells committing suicide. All cells carry a death gene that causes a sudden influx and release of calcium ions that causes the mitochondria to release a protein called Diablo. Diablo, of course, is Spanish for devil. It's the devil, it's this devil protein. Diablo binds to inhibitors, apoptosis proteins, IAPs, that have been inhibiting a family of proteins called caspases. Okay, so we have Diablo. Diablo creates the inhibitor of apoptosis protein, the IAPs, and the IAPs release the caspases, and that destroys the cell. As much fun as that is. The caspases are proteases or enzymes that dissolve protein. All cells are made out of protein. The caspases break down the protein in the DNA of the neuron. Normally, Diablo is inhibited by BCL2. Cells that are able to make proper and adequate synaptic connections are the ones that live, while those that don't will die, rather than make a poor connection. Chemicals that enable proper growth are called neurotropic factors. So all of this stuff is taking place all the time. And this is one of the reasons why we are such perfect beings. But this, of course, is happening to all animals. All animals have this same structure. So the reason that we're so damn smart, the reason that we don't limp, the reason that we don't have problems seeing is because of these neuronal connections, these perfect neuronal connections. And we have too many connections, and the connections aren't perfect, they die. The neurons die. They destroy themselves because they're not perfect. Okay, that's why we're both so perfect. Okay, there we go.
Now I know why.
There you go. You were confused before. Apoptosis. So all of that stuff, your cells just die. Your neurons just die. That's a joke. Integrating signals hinting at Obsolescence, George undergoes apoptosis, his head explodes. Okay, all right, I know, it's a joke. He's
Yeah.
obsolescent, okay. All of his kids are telling him how old-fashioned he is, and his wife, of course. Scientists have discovered a substance that promotes the growth of spinal ganglia that they call nerve growth factor. If a technique could be developed to use nerve growth factor effectively, spinal injuries could be repaired back to normal function, but of course, this is something that happens inside your own body, and since it happens inside your own body, we can't arrest it, we can't utilize it. With time and experience, some synapses disengage and other synapses are formed. This process is especially prevalent during cell death in the area, refining the remaining synapses to provide optimum connections. While neurons and glial cells develop from the same source cells, scientists don't know what informs the cells to end up as one or the other. While neuronal growth takes place, we're talking about glial cells. So the glial cells and the neuronal cells are actually the same structure. But we don't know why one becomes a glial cell and the other becomes a neuron. We're not exactly sure why they differentiate like that. Because they come from the same source. So, why? While neuronal growth takes place almost exclusively before birth, glial cells have their greatest growth surge right after birth and continue to grow throughout your life. And these are the cells that form all these interesting connections that we have in our bodies. These are the cells that try to repair our brains when we have damage to our brains. This is the reason that it takes 18 months. If you have meth head, it takes 18 months for it to repair itself. But after 18 months, your intellectual capability is almost identical to what it was before you took crystal meth. Now, why would that be? If this stuff is so toxic and it creates such memory problems, why isn't it permanent? And sometimes it is, of course, especially if somebody's psychotic. But normally they recover. How in the world do you recover? Scott, of course, had brain damage. 15% of his brain is not there anymore because of the explosion.
Oh, yeah.
How can he recover from loss of 15% of your brain? As an adult, it happened to him when he was an adult. If it happened to him as a child, it would just automatically repair itself. But he's being repaired every day. I don't know if you can tell the difference. I probably shouldn't say this, but he seems to be getting better and better, just like every day. And you can see it. It's exciting. I'm so impressed.
Yeah.
And I'll take full credit for everything.
I would.
Why not? The glial cells, but the reality is this brain's repairing itself. Okay, and this is a continual process. The glial cells provide myelin for the axons of the neuron. The myelin protects, feeds, and accelerates the electrical responses to the neuron on the neuron. Myelination allows people to walk with coordination in the brain to process information rapidly, and that's what glial cells do. Multiple sclerosis, of course, is an autoimmune disease that affects select individuals. The condition allows the immune system to attack the myelin of the neurons and leave gaps in the structure that slows the neuronal response. And that's what multiple sclerosis is. It attacks the glial cells. Glial cells break down, and now you can't move as well as you did before. Eventually, you become completely paralyzed because you're losing all of your glial cells. It's an autoimmune disease. It's your body is attacking itself. Lots of autoimmune diseases out there. There seem to be more now than there were before. Something in our modern times are creating all of these problems. Psoriasis is another autoimmune disease. What else? Lupus, of course. Arthritis. Rheumatoid arthritis. Type 2 diabetes is a kind of autoimmune disease. It
attacks. It's itself.
It creates, you do something to yourself that makes you attack yourself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because now all of a sudden your cells aren't utilizing insulin properly. That doesn't make any sense. Why would that happen? Intrinsic factors in the development of the nervous system deal with genetic factors that allow for proper development. Alzheimer's disease is a form of autoimmune disease. It's your brain attacking itself. It can't clear out all of the debris in your brain. So it's a form of autoimmune disease. When genetic aberrations occur, it can cause abnormal brain development. Tay-Sachs disease causes the destruction of neurons that eventually results in death. It has been identified as a flaw on the 15th chromosome. So this is a genetic disease, that you're born with this disease. You'll never be able to reproduce. Individuals with Tay-Sachs disease die within the first 5 years of life. Yeah, it's pretty ugly too. Down syndrome causes intellectual disability and body abnormalities. It has been identified as an extra chromosome on the 21st pair. So there are mutations. We do see mutations. Tay-Sachs disease, of course, somebody with Down syndrome potentially could reproduce. Doesn't happen very often, but they could do that. Tay-Sachs disease, of course, kills you within 5 years. So that individual will never be able to reproduce.
How did that start, the Tay-Sachs? I never heard of it. Like how?
Tay-Sachs disease is a degenerative nerve disease, so the nerves slowly die. So the baby's born normal, and then as the baby develops, as time goes by, they lose the ability to, they never sit up. All they can do is lay down because they can't, by the time they would sit up like at 5 or 6 months, the neuronal degeneration has already started, and they never are able to sit up. Eventually they go blind, they go deaf. It's pretty ugly.
It's really sad.
And they die within 5 years. Most of them die within the first 2 years. Down syndrome, of course, we see that all the time. It's on television from time to time. Extrinsic factors include malnutrition, can cause problems with the select individual. Fetal alcohol syndrome, of course. The baby is actually perfect, but the mother does drink so much alcohol that the brain doesn't develop normally. There are physical malfunctions, the baby will have heart problems. Hypoxia-induced intellectual disability. If the baby doesn't get oxygen right away, the baby, strangely enough, the baby's in a oxygen-free environment in the uterus. As soon as it's born, it has to revert to breathing oxygen from the air. And this is what it does almost instantaneously. There are certain types of hemoglobin, the fetal hemoglobin, which allow the baby to utilize the mother's oxygen that it gets from the mother's blood. But that fetal hemoglobin has to be converted to adult hemoglobin. And this process has to takes place in the last month of gestation. The baby is slowly decreasing the amount of fetal hemoglobin it has in its system, and it has to convert it to adult hemoglobin. When it's born, this has to take place right away because the baby has to start breathing. Yeah. That's one of the reasons why we do what we do when the baby's born. If the baby hasn't broken down enough of its fetal hemoglobin, then it will become jaundice, because when you break down a red cell, you get bilirubin. Bilirubin's yellow, is a bright yellow. So the baby will turn yellow if it can't break down, if it becomes jaundice. That's what jaundice means. Okay, and this can destroy its brain cells. So this has to take place fairly quickly. I know. This is one of the jobs I used to do, especially in the when I worked in the children's hospital. So we were constantly drawing newborn babies' blood to make sure that they were breaking down the bilirubin. Of course, you break down the bilirubin. Light breaks down bilirubin, as odd as that seems. So if the baby has too high a bilirubin count, then they'll put them under the lights.
Yeah.
Okay, but they have to cover the eyes because it will destroy their optic nerves. gets really kind of interesting. So we would draw their blood and check their bilirubin level. If it was too high, then they put them under the lights. They couldn't let them go home. They had to hold on to them to make sure that everything got converted properly. Some of the intrinsic factors are referred to as the genotype. The genotype also, plus the extrinsic factors represent an individual's phenotype. So you have brown eyes, is that correct? Brown eyes? Okay. You have brown eyes. Brown eyes are your genotype. But if one of your parents had blue eyes, then that parent would have to give you the blue-eyed gene. But if one of your parents has brown eyes and they have never had a blue-eyed ancestor, then you have to have brown eyes. You don't have a choice. Because brown eyes are dominant over blue eyes.
Yeah.
Blue eyes are always recessive. Okay. So you could have two brown-eyed parents, and as long as both of them had a genotype, the hidden type, was blue-eyed, then potentially you could have blue eyes. And of course, your dad would claim that your mother had sex with the milkman or something, or the mailman or something. My brother has brown hair, and his wife has brown hair, and their baby, they had one child, and that child had red hair. So how did that happen? Well, they both had brown hair gene, obviously, but they also had a light-haired gene, probably a red-haired gene. My mother was red-headed, so despite the fact my brother had brown hair, one of his genes was a red-headed gene. It matched with a red-headed gene from the person that he impregnated, and so they had a red-headed baby. I know. I have two kids. I have blue eyes, so I don't have a choice. I have to give a blue-eyed gene for my offspring. But my wife had brown eyes, and both of my kids had brown eyes. But my daughter had a baby, and she reproduced with a blue-eyed man, and her baby turned out with blue eyes. The most shocking blue eyes you ever saw. I know. So that was she gave, her ova had my blue-eyed genes on it, because her mother had brown eyes.
Yeah.
So it had to be my gene. His blue eyes are because of me. Okay. And because of his father, of course. So the hidden gene, whatever you have that's hidden is your genotype. And what you display is your phenotype. Okay? As much fun as that is. All right. So both of your parents have brown eyes?
Yeah.
Okay. And there's no blue-eyed ancestry anywhere?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, no, okay.
I don't
If
think
you had no blue-eyed ancestry, then and you reproduced with a blue-eyed woman. Okay, there you go. That baby would have brown eyes if you don't have any blue-eyed ancestry. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Just like my kids have brown eyes, despite the fact that I was their father.
But you gave them the blue gene.
I did. I gave
and
them
they
the
can
blue
pass
gene.
that on.
And that was passed on to my grandson.
Yes.
When mutations take place in a species' genetic history, the mutation most often creates a maladaptive circumstance. And that's what we saw. If we saw any mutations when I was working in the hospital, usually it was maladaptive. Dwarfism. We had a baby that was born with dwarfism. We had a baby, we had Tay-Sachs disease. Tay-Sachs disease will always kill the baby. We had genetic mutation. We had one baby that had its heart born outside of its chest cavity. That was a little weird. We had a baby without a skull. That was real weird. Yeah. That didn't work.
They don't survive.
Well, they can't survive. They don't have a skull. Didn't have any shape to its head.
No.
The question was, how in the world did she ever carry the baby full term? I mean, that was a question we were asking ourselves. We had a baby that was born with, it had psoriasis so bad, it had an autoimmune disease that was so bad that if you touched its finger would fall off. It was like the joints were connected.
Yeah.
These are all mutations that can't possibly survive. On a rare occasion when the mutation is actually useful to the species, the mutation will be reproduced in the offspring. Blue eyes are a mutation. Blue-eyed people can see better at night. Brown-eyed people can see better during the day in the sunlight. Filters, the blue eyes don't filter out the sun as well as brown eyes do. So you can see better at night and I can see better, or you can see better during the day and I can see better at night. Now this gets kind of weird because why in the world would you need to see at night? Maybe you're afraid of the dark. A lot of people are afraid of the dark. Are they all brown-eyed people or are some of them blue-eyed people? I can see really well at night, real well during, but then again, I used to live on a farm, so we go out in the dark all the time. It's never ever really dark outside. There's always starlight, there's always moonlight. If there's a moon to any extent at all, you can see fairly well. But if you have brown eyes, then you don't see very well in the dark at all, because your brown eyes are filtering out. Of course, your pupil is expanded to a massive degree, but you don't. It does. You filter out almost all the light with your irises. As weird as that sounds. So that's why blue-eyed people do exist. The mutation wasn't so severe that it destroyed the species or destroyed the offspring. Okay. White skin, obviously. I mean, if we look at people in Africa where it's so sunny all the time, everybody in Africa has very dark skin, relatively dark skin. Now the interesting thing is that not all Africans are that dark. The people that live in North Africa are not as dark. The people that live in the southern portion of Africa are not all that dark. They're more like Asians. They have yellowish skin. So if we look at the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert, they're not black like most Africans are. Very, very dark. But of course, they evolved in very bright sunlight, so they needed that filter. White person in the same environment, of course, they burn up and die. Literally burn up and die. As weird as that sounds. So why in the world do people have white skin or have no don't have dark skin? Why are there people that don't have dark skin? Who are these people and where did they come from? Are they ghost people? Why are there white people? What happened to allow them to survive? If most people have dark skin, why in the world are there even any white people? Or not dark people? There must have been some kind of an environment where that was adaptive. And that environment had to do with the Ice Age, where it was overcast all the time, not so much sun. So they didn't need dark skin to filter. They didn't need to filter out the sun because there was not that much sun. But the problem is that we need sunlight in order to produce calcium to process calcium so that our bones are strong. Yeah. So we have vitamin D. People that have very light skin have vitamin D deficiencies. As weird as that is. Okay. So these people have to take in vitamin D. My wife called me this weekend and said she had her vitamin D checked and it's low, so she has to start taking vitamins. But her problem, or the real problem, is that she's a very pale person. She never goes outside. Okay, so she can't process her vitamin D properly without sunlight. How do I make my wife go outside? Can't. She's a southerner. She's smarter than I am. Experience is an important factor in brain development. The human brain is only 1/4 its adult size at birth, yet few new neurons are added. The reason for the exceptional growth is due to dendrite growth and myelination. Dendrite growth and myelination are induced by experience with the various muscles and sensory organs of the body. So it has to do with experience. Where are you and what are you experiencing? Because we have white people, and white people have very pale skin, they had to evolve in an environment where there was not as much sunlight.